Genesis, or Bereshit in Hebrew, chapter 2, verses 4 to 25, cover the second creation narrative. Some topics we will cover include the creation of man and woman, the Garden of Eden, the Tree of Life, and the Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil. In this video, we will look into the rest of chapter 2, which, according to Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, takes us into, quote, the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that Yahweh God made the earth and the heavens. But before we get into this second creation account, we need to look at how God is being addressed in this chapter. In chapter 1, God is simply referred to as God, but in chapter 2, God is referred to as Yahweh God. What is the difference? Well, as we will learn later on in the book of Exodus, Yahweh is God's personal name. Unfortunately, this translation of God's personal name is only an assumption of what it was spelled or sounded like. In the Hebrew language, God's personal name was shortened and hidden into what we call the Tetragrammaton, which is shown in the picture on the slide. This is the four-letter Hebrew word YHWH. Nobody knows how to pronounce or properly say God's personal name, so many interpretations are made of the name, like Yahweh, Jehovah, and etc. The reason God is only referred to as God in chapter 1 is likely because of the work God did outside of earth in this kind of transcendent character in chapter 1. However, in this chapter 2, the word Yahweh is used because God is playing an active role on earth and creation, and God's presence is actually on the planet, as we will see more clearly throughout the chapter. While on the topic, I should mention that there are many titles for God in the Tanakh or Old Testament. These names include Elohim, El Olam, Jehovah, and many more. In most modern-day English translations, however, many names for God are just translated into Yahweh or Lord. Alright. Moving forward with the lecture, we are taken to the days when God created the heavens and the earth. This gives us context as to what has already been created. We can assume that the sun, moon, stars, and solid land, earth, were already created by God by this point. The history begins on earth at a time, as stated in Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, when, quote, no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. The reason for this, as we will read further into verse 5, is, quote, God had not caused it to rain on earth, and, quote, there was not a man to till the ground. This verse is important for two main reasons. It supports modern science, and it gives insight into the purpose of mankind. Rain is water, and water is required to support life on a planet. For plants, water is required for the process of photosynthesis, where plants use energy from both the sun and nutrients from water to create their own food. Furthermore, linking plant life with human life, photosynthesis provides oxygen to the atmosphere, which is necessary to recycle our air and provide more oxygen to us. Also, plants provide food, medicinal properties, and other beneficial goods that help support human life. Likewise, humans help plants survive through irrigation, watering plants, making sure enough sunlight gets to the plants by maintaining them. So, to begin putting life on earth, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 6, God summons a mist, which, quote, watered the whole surface of the ground. After this, plant life is now feasible, making earth more suitable for humans. Now, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, we are introduced to the origins of human life. Man, as stated in the verse, come, quote, from the dust of the ground, and received life when God, quote, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. So, why is it important that mankind came from the ground? Well, as we have found in Genesis chapter 2 verse 5, humans were meant to keep and cultivate plant life. So this origin is very symbolic. Okay, so what is the breath of life? To understand this, we need to understand that God is the source of all life on earth. For humans, God literally breathes animating life, a consciousness, and the capacity to have a relationship with Him to mankind. It is important for humans to be spiritual because we were created to have a relationship with God, as we will see in the chapter when God walks on earth and speaks to man. We have our minds to help us think about what we are doing and how we should do things. We have life to be alive. If we were just the dust material formed into the shape of man, we would just be sitting there, inanimate. It is God that provided life to make us move, talk, and think. After completing all of the prerequisites to support plant life and human life, God now, in Genesis chapter 2 verse 8, quote, planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put man whom he had formed. Well, what is this Garden of Eden? Well, in Genesis chapter 2 verses 9 through 14, it describes the contents within the Garden of Eden and its geographic location. In verse 9, we are told that God made, quote, every tree to grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. This source of food for humans will allow a special relationship between mankind and plants. We depend on the food and nutrients from trees, so we help keep and maintain plant life to stay alive in turn. Now, aside from the normal trees described in the first part of verse 9, in the other half we are told of two unique trees. The tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. These unique trees are described as having fruit also. So what makes them unique from the other trees described in this verse? Well, the tree of life is what gives immortality, or possibly the source of extended life as long as you keep eating from the tree. So, as we will learn in the next chapter, the tree of life is immortal as well and had to be protected. But I will not speak on that topic right now. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as we will also learn about in the next chapter, gives the knowledge of God, which is often categorized by scholars as knowledge of things that divide instead of unite people in nature together. Things like sex and perversion, race, ethnicity, selfishness, laziness, and the desire to explore and do what people want to do instead of God's original plan for mankind will come to those who eat from the fruit of this tree. Another great part of the geographic location of Eden is the large amount of water available for mankind and the trees to survive. In Genesis chapter 2 verse 10 we are told, quote, a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it was parted and became the source of 4 rivers. Now in Genesis chapter 2 verses 11 through 14, we are told the name of each of the rivers that come together at the Garden of Eden. River 1 is the Pishon River. This river is unique because it is rich in resources like gold, bdellium plants, and onyx stone. These little details refer to God's creation of the universe and the formation of elements that God has made, as I have explained in the last lecture. Gold is a metal and the element. Onyx is made from the elements silicon, oxygen, and other elements like quartz and mogonite, depending on the stone. Another important detail is that this river, quote, flows through the whole land of Havilah. Fortunately, scholars don't have an exact location of Havilah or the Pishon River. River 2 is the Gihon River. This river, quote, flows through the whole land of Cush. Unfortunately, scholars don't have an exact location for the Gihon River or the land of Cush as well. River 3 is the Hiddekel River, which is another name for the Tigris River. This river, quote, flows in front of Assyria. Thankfully, the Tigris River's location is known today and still flows to countries like Iraq, Turkey, and Iran to this day. The fourth river is the famous Euphrates River, which starts in Turkey and flows from Syria to Iraq. As for the location of the Garden of Eden, scholars are not positive. Many explorers have claimed the location of the Garden of Eden. They have claimed to know where the Garden of Eden is. Here are a few theories. Juris Zarnis from Missouri State University. He's a professor and archaeologist who specializes in the Middle East, believes that it was in southern Mesopotamia where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet the ocean, or in the Armenian Plateau or highlands. Many scholars follow this opinion, and it appears to be the most likely origin of the Garden of Eden, seeing that it is in the Fertile Crescent, which is often referred to as the cradle of civilization. Another theory is that made by British archaeologist David Rohl. He claims that the Garden of Eden was located somewhere in Iran, around the Tabriz area. Christopher Columbus claims it was in central Southern America during his third voyage to the Americas. Others believe the location to be in Jerusalem, England, and even Northern America. Okay, now that we covered the contents within the Garden of Eden, now we can cover the transfer of man into the Garden of Eden. In Genesis chapter 2 verse 15, we are told that, quote, Yahweh God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate and keep it. This verse points back to Genesis chapter 2 verse 5, where it says that we were created to, quote, cultivate and keep the earth, which includes the trees and plants in the Garden of Eden. Now, once the man was placed into the Garden of Eden, he is told that he can, quote, freely eat of every plant of the garden. However, in Genesis chapter 2 verse 17, man also receives his first warning from God, which was, quote, you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. You will surely die. Okay, so what is this death, and what does it tell us about human and vegetation life at the time of creation? There are many theories that try to explain this death, so here are a few prominent ones that I have gathered. One of the theories is related to the tree of life. It is possible that the tree of life does not immediately provide immortality to mankind, but it extends the life of the person eating it. Therefore, mankind lived essentially forever because they could continually eat from the tree of life. So, if mankind loses access to the tree of life, then they will die naturally. Another possible explanation is that the death God is referring to could be referring to the death of the pure relationship between mankind and God. Another likely explanation, similar to the tree of life theory, can be seen in the next chapter when mankind is expelled from the Garden of Eden, away from the readily available water and fruit from the garden, making living a lot more difficult for mankind. Alright. After God is placed After man is placed in the Garden of Eden, God sees that the man is alone, and he's being left alone to cultivate and keep the Garden of Eden. Therefore, God begins to, quote, make him a helper comparable to him. God first attempts this in Genesis chapter 2, verse 19, when, quote, out of the ground Yahweh God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man. Now how can animals and birds help keep and cultivate the earth? Well, animals like squirrels bury nuts in stashes, which sometimes grows into trees that provide oxygen into the atmosphere. Birds help balance nature by dropping tree seeds and even pollinating plants. Animals play a big role in the environment and help balance and maintain the environment. There are many other examples, but those are just two general ones. Now, in addition to creating other life forms to help cultivate and keep the land, God also gives man dominion over those living creatures. In verse Genesis chapter 2, verse 20, we are told that the man, quote, gave names to all livestock and to the birds of the sky and to every animal of the field, to show man's dominion over all of them. However, at the end of verse 20, we are told that, quote, for man there was not found a helper comparable to him. After seeing this, God decides to create a helper for man that comes from the man himself. Therefore, God causes the man to sleep and takes one of the man's ribs. Then in Genesis chapter 2, verse 22, God, quote, made a woman from the rib which he had taken from the man and brought her to the man. Genesis chapter 2, verse 23 describes man's first interaction with the woman when the man says, quote, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman because she was taken out of man. This verse is important because it describes the close relationship between man and woman, because they both make up mankind or humanity, and will continue. Now that there's two, they can continue the human race. Woman comes from the rib of man and now shares similar bones and flesh from man. For this reason, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, the man will, quote, leave his father and his mother and will join his wife, and they will be one flesh. Because woman is the comparable companion and helper to man mentioned in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. Now, there's much debate on what bone was taken from the man to create the woman. Some believe it is man's baculum or phallus bone, found in some mammals and many primates. Some might argue that it was actually one of man's joints or an actual rib bone. Nevertheless, the point is that woman came from man. The final verse, Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, describes man and woman's unity as husband and wife in the purity of their relationship with God. They were, quote, both naked and they were not ashamed. They are comfortable because they did not break God's one warning to mankind, to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They are currently in God's good graces and are doing what they were put on earth to do, cultivate and keep the earth together. Everything is in the order that God has intended. Alright, so now that the lecture is finished, I will now read Genesis chapter 2 from ebible.org using the World English Bible Protestant Edition translation, which is in the public domain. This is the history of the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created. In the day that Yahweh God made the earth and the heavens. No plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. For Yahweh God had not caused it to rain on the earth. There was not a man to till the ground. But a mist went up from the earth, and watered the whole surface of the ground. Yahweh God formed man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Yahweh God planted a garden eastward, in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground Yahweh God made every tree to grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it was parted, and became the source of 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. It flowed through the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are also there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the same river that flows through the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Hiddekel. This is the one which flows in front of Assyria. The fourth river is the Euphrates. Yahweh God took the man and put him into the garden of Eden to cultivate and keep it. Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Yahweh God said, It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. Out of the ground Yahweh God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. Whatever the man called every living creature became its name. The man gave names to all livestock, and to the birds of the sky, and to every animal of the field. But for man there was not found a helper comparable to him. Yahweh God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. As the man slept, he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh in its place. Yahweh God made a woman from the rib which he had taken from the man, and brought her to the man. The man said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man will leave his father and his mother, and will join with his wife, and they will be one flesh. The man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next lecture.